Hello, ngHouston. So tonight we're excited because we have Jeff and Patrick talking about Angular Universal. I have been wanting to look at this for a long time. I've heard a lot of good things about it, and I haven't had a chance to yet. So this is actually my first look at Angular Universal. I want to introduce Josh. Josh, you want to say hello?
Hey guys, this is a local Houston native. Looking forward to this.
Yep. So Josh has been mentioning that he's been playing with Angular Universal. He's from here in Houston, and then I also have Chris Griffith, who's interested too. And Chris, you want to say hi?
Hello, everyone. I'm actually out in San Diego.
That's awesome. How's the weather out there? Probably nice. Isn't it always nice?
That's what the choice board tells us to say.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so Jeff and Patrick. Jeff, you want to introduce yourself first, and then?
Sure. Jeff Whelpley. I'm the CTO of a company called GetHuman, and Google developer expert, work on Angular Universal, do some other stuff. Have a new puppy that is most of my job, is like my second job now. Other than that, that's about it.
I think we're going to need pics of that little dog.
Yes.
Patrick,
cool.
You want to say hi?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Patrick Stapleton, also known as Patrick JS. That's actually my initials, also stands for JavaScript. I run a company called OneSpeed. We do consulting, training, and everything Angular and pretty much the JavaScript space. And worked with Jeff to build Universal as well as merge it into Core. Yeah.
That's awesome. So I vote one of you should share your screen and show us some cool stuff.
Yeah, I'll start off sharing my screen. And usually, especially for this type of event, I like to give like a little bit of a backstory because, part of this is like a personal journey for me and started even way before I met Patrick. When I joined GetHuman, the company where I've been working for the past 4 years, I kind of had like an interesting problem because GetHuman is a site that's been around for a long time and provides has provided for a while free information about contact phone numbers and emails and that type of thing for different companies. So if you Google, let's say, Facebook phone number, or phone number or customer service or anything like that, GetHuman always shows up in like the top 5 of the search rankings. And if you go there, then there's the phone number and then a bunch of information about how to get through the call tree or tips on how to call them and different information about how to solve your problems. And so this is a server rendered website. And 4 years ago when I joined the company, it was just LAMP stack, PHP and static web pages and everything like that. And it was something where we wanted to add rich user features and sort of live in both of these worlds where it was still SEO heavy and needed to cater to people who come visit us from search engines. We were getting something like 5 million people a month coming through organic search to our site. But by the same respect, we wanted to also provide a lot of like real-time interfaces on the site and just rich interfaces that come along with, at that time was like Backbone and Angular and Ember were like the 3 main client-side frameworks that were at play. So we started to implement Angular, but it didn't actually have any server rendering capabilities for Angular 1, this was. And so I sort of built this very hacked version that really only worked for us and wasn't anything, even though I thought about open sourcing it, but it really wasn't able to be open sourced at all. A way that we can basically take Angular 1 written code and have it server rendered. So actually on the GetHuman site right now, for these phone number pages, like there's other parts of the site that we've have in Angular 2 and Angular 4 and the latest versions, but these contact pages are still actually rendered in the kind of hacked Angular 1 server rendered solution that we came up with. So actually on any of these contact pages, if you do like server equals true, this is actually just fully a server rendered page. This has no client-side app at all. So you'll notice that like kind of in the upper right-hand corner, it doesn't have like a login link or anything personalized. It's all kind of anonymous content. Whereas if you take that server true out, then the client-side app will kick in and you'll get like some of these richer features for either login or search or whatever else you want to deal with. So moving to like some presentations here, when you talk about why do you need or want server rendering in the first place, I'm going to talk like kind of like 5,000 foot view, and then I'll kind of like take it down to just more of the discussion level and like bring Patrick in, and we can like talk about some like more lower level details. But at the kind of like 5,000 foot view, some of the main reasons why you want to use a server rendering is link preview. So like when you're using social apps, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, the latest version or latest Google robot or Google crawler will pull in some client-side rendered views, but typically the social sharing will not actually render your client-side JavaScript. It'll only grab your server view. And so if you have a publicly facing app and you want people to share links and you want them to preview it, this is actually kind of a big deal. So that's something that definitely, regardless of anything else, I mean, who cares about service worker when it comes to this? It's all about the server rendered view. And then, say SEO here, but actually in a different presentation, I described this in a slightly different way. But it still does matter for search ranking that for sure anything outside of Google doesn't do client-side rendering as well as the Google crawler. And even for the Google crawler, it's not perfect. So there is still advantages to having things server rendered for SEO reasons, despite the Google crawler's abilities, client-side rendering abilities. And actually, I'm going to skip over progressive enhancement because that's not as big of a thing. Yeah, so the way that I sort of talk about this, or we've talked about it for a long time, is that there is this web app gap, which is basically a difference between when you see the server view and when the client kicks in. And that matters because there could be as many as 3 seconds or more where this is, you're basically looking at the server view before the client kicks in. Now, there's a lot of stuff more recently that helps with this. For not for the initial page load, but for subsequent visits, service worker helps a ton here because you can proxy a lot of the stuff that you're usually pulling in for assets and that type of thing. And so that definitely solves repeat visitors being able to load faster. But for initial load, you still have that problem. Another thing that helps here is the lazy loading. So Angular, the latest version of Angular, does a really great job of, or at least allows you to use the router to break up your app into small pieces and kind of lazy load them. So the size of the initial payload is smaller and will load faster, so you don't see this as much. But not everybody does that. It's still, and the server view is still faster. And then the other thing with Angular Universal and doing things on the client and the server the same, this was just a different presentation that we did one time talking about sort of arguing in favor of using the same language and the same technology on both the server and the client, that using kind of like a hammer for everything, because technically you could use different technologies to do server running or do your server side. You could, and people do this sometimes, have .NET or Java backend, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And you can even use .NET with Angular Universal. But in this particular presentation, we were kind of advocating for just going full JavaScript for everything, because it kind of avoids context switching and code duplication and everything like that. And then one thing that people ask us, from time to time is like, should I care about Angular Universal? And I mentioned some of this in the other one I was showing you, but it's basically if you care about any of these three things, then yes. And it doesn't have to be an external app. Like sometimes even for internal apps, you do care about initial load. And there are, like I mentioned, there are things like service worker and lazy loading that you can help with that as well. But depending on the performance characteristics that you're trying to achieve, sometimes internally it does matter. Although I will say that for the most part, internally, I probably wouldn't bother, to be honest, even though like there are some cases where it does. Most of the time, if you're building an internal app, it's not worth it to try to do server-side rendering as well. You really should just utilize it for externally facing apps. Let me get through that. Yeah, so that I just really quickly went through kind of like the high points of stuff that we always used to talk about. I'm just trying to see. Yeah, that's it for the most part. I do have some code that I was going to go over as well, but why don't I use this as an opportunity to kind of take a break and open it up for some discussion. So just in terms of like concepts, like I'd be interested, well, first of all, Patrick, do you think I missed anything in terms of concepts that we usually talk about?
No, that sounds about right. Basically, the way Universal works is that you have the same application, and then we just run the same application on the server. But then it's running against a JavaScript representation of the document, and then anything your application does changes that JavaScript representation, that tree. That's just JS, right? And then we convert that to a string and set it down.
I just saw universal patterns, and I thought you were about to. What is that? Is that a totally different thing, or is that related, or is that just the way that it's structured?
No, it's something that when you have your app that's rendering on the client and the server, there are certain things, problems that come up. And so, let me share this out again real quick. Sure. Oops. So these 6 things are, and there's probably even more than this, but these are things that come up as issues when you are trying to do it. And really quickly kind of going through them, the gap events, what that means is in between the time when you're seeing your server view and when the client side kicks in, the user can click on the page or interact with the page. So if you think about it, your client app is non-functional, like it's not actually running yet. It hasn't bootstrapped yet, but the user is seeing a button, an input box, etc. So the problem with gap events are like it's the events that occur in between that gap when there's the server view and the client view. And the way that we solve that is we have something called Preboot that here, I have this near the end. Yeah, so we have this thing called Preboot, which basically records all of those events during that gap. Like it's an inline JavaScript that's included in the server view and it just records every single event on the page. Well, pretty much every single event. And then once the client-side app kicks in, then it'll replay it. So this is something that's unique to Angular and Angular Universal. Even though there is server rendering in other frameworks like React and that type of thing, they don't have this, although I built Preboot in a way that you actually can use this with React, and actually there is a pretty good number of people, at least a couple dozen from people that I've talked to, that actually use React with Preboot to record the gap events and then play the back. So it's not Angular specific. And then what were you going to say?
It looks like, so with these 6 patterns that, I mean, these are issues that I've had in apps that I've written even internally.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe Angular Universal is helpful in these things, even if you're not doing search engine stuff.
Yeah, no, you definitely can use Preboot even if you don't use the rest of Angular Universal. So a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about is part of like the Angular stack, but isn't necessarily all tied together. You can use them to solve specific problems. For async, the specific thing I'm talking about there is that there's an interesting thing on the server side. Like on the client side, you can have all sorts of events occurring at the same time, and they don't have to be coordinated generally. Like, it doesn't matter that you're firing off 3 different calls to the back end in 3 different places of your app, and they don't necessarily have to be aware of each other on the client side. But on the server side, you actually do have to have everything know what the current status is, because we need to know exactly when to send back that server view. And that has to be a very specific time. You can't, you can stream stuff like with some of the new streaming API, but at least for the current setup, we need to know when the app, what we call the app is stable. Stable is the term, quote unquote, used for when all of the async events have completed. And the mechanism of how we know that is through Zone.js. So Zone wraps every async call, and in Angular Universal, or the platform server now, we kind of keep track of all of those async events, know when they're completed, and then are able to send back a response from the server once that stability is reached. Patrick, did I describe that correctly?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I have lots more questions, but I want to see. I know you guys are going to show it to us, but Josh had a question real quick, and then we can jump in and you can show us.
So it seems like you guys are using Node.js as the server-side rendering. I come from a PHP shop, so in some cases we're upgrading to 7. I'm curious what benchmarks you guys have done and how you've seen it compared to other server-side compiling, I guess, just measurements. How does this server-side rendering pan out with similar applications that are written in server-side languages?
Okay. I guess I could start answering that, and then Jeff, you help me out on some of the other languages. But in some cases, like Ruby on Rails, where you're dealing with a lot of just synchronous code, right? You have to deal with a lot of parallelizing the application. Right. With Node.js, particularly with Angular, you don't have so much of an issue because it's asynchronous, and you could parallelize your applications within that one node, and then do the exact same scaling. But for a lot of times, the thing is, the way you scale Universal is the same way you scale any other server-side application. That is, you have to do caching, you have to do multiple processes and whatnot. And you could kind of think of it as more of like a templating language, right, on top of your thing. So anything that you would do for, like, say, Jade or EJS or any other templating language, anything you would do to scale that, you would do the same thing for Universal. The benefit is that you're just writing the whole thing in one language, or writing everything in TypeScript and you're writing everything in Angular. So that's really what you're getting, is that just solidifying the tech stack. But performance-wise, it's it's good. And again, if it's more like you run into the same scaling problems as anything else.
Okay. Now, would you say you're the general Universal team, and I know it's not a team, but it's kind of an open source thing, right? Angular took this over as well, or they didn't take it over, but they merged it now into the project. It's just kind of officially Angular now. Are you guys working on solving some of those cache-related issues, and maybe not issues, but just that heavy work that sometimes has to be done? Because I know in other languages there's like frameworks in place that handle difficult things like caching. So is that stuff you guys are trying to tackle right now in the project, or is that on me?
Well, it's more of like the thing about that is that everyone has their own problems, right? So ASP.NET, they're building their own abstraction on top of Angular in order to create the caching mechanisms. And there's only so much you could do before you start getting to that realm where it's like, well, I use Varnish or I use Redis, you know, like I use this and like it needs to work for me as well, right?
Okay.
So in terms of that, like the Angular team, I can speak for them saying like they don't want to venture into that, right? It's something that the community can create, and you'll find out that it's actually pretty easy to deal with because you're just creating a service at the end of the day, and then you just interact with the node version or adapter interacting with Redis, right? So it's very similar. Again, like it's easier to think of it as just a templating language, and anything you do to scale any other templating language, you do the same thing. And if you think of it that way, then doing the integrations would make a lot more sense, because then you say, oh, for this section, I need to cache that. So you just create like a directive that caches or serializes the node, the tree into a string, and then whenever you hit that, you just convert it back. So
you say that like it's no big deal. You just create a directive that serializes.
Caching.
Well,
it's like that thing you draw the owl and then you go here. You just draw a circle and then you have an owl.
Owl like this, and it's easy. Well, it's I guess another way to put it is that it's really easy to kind of be overwhelmed by this, and that's why I keep saying like it's easier to think of it like that as a smaller scope, because then it's easier to digest like the approaches to tackle it, right? Like it's easier to say like, oh, if it's just a templating language, how do I scale that? Well, you scale it this way. Okay, cool. Now how do I do that in here, right? You just break it down, and then if you're able to break it down that way, then it's a lot easier. It's more clear to see like how to solve it.
Yeah, that is more clear. Thanks.
Well, so the one thing I would add is that performance is like people use the term performance, but that's like a loaded term because there's so many different aspects to performance. If for part of the question you brought up with like PHP, like there's a couple of aspects to that. You know, first, a lot of times when you have performance issues, it's not the thing you think. It's like more, the way that you're making calls to the back end. It's not necessarily the rendering itself. It's more like within your app, the way you have it structured and the way, like when you get your data versus like converting a template into like HTML. So I think what you're probably really asking, because a lot of stuff like for caching and for data access in the back end, it's just a matter of like how you set it up. But the thing like for like is if you had no gathering data, just a static template, and or maybe a series of templates, and you have the template in PHP and you just want to render that, and the template in Angular and you want to render that. In that, just that alone, I haven't done this in a while, but I would guess that the Angular Universal is slightly slower than PHP, just because there is a lot of overhead with PHP is built to do that specifically, whereas Angular is built to do like all sorts of other things, in addition to that, and we're sort of like fitting the rendering part into that. But the gap is not that great. I don't have like specific numbers, but like I just know that it still does perform pretty well to the degree that you probably wouldn't notice it. Plus, you add on the fact that that's not your problem most of the time. Most of the time, it's with all the other stuff. And when we've talked to other people in the community who run into issues, it's usually not with that specifically. It's usually with how they're making their database calls, or things that can be easily solved with like different levels of caching. Is that your experience too, Patrick, for the people that you've dealt with?
Yeah, that's basically what I was trying to get at, is that a lot of the problems that people run into are the same problems you would run into using another technology. It's more of like they just haven't thought about it that way. It's like, oh, if you do this in PHP, then naturally everyone in every tutorial will say, oh, you have to do this for like caching. So you do it naturally.
Yeah.
And then you do the universal one and you don't think about it, and you're like, this should be fast. And you don't realize that you did an optimization over there, but didn't do the same one here.
I think you guys answered it really well. I guess as a technical person, like I was curious if the overall performance of the system is comparable. And it sounds like, Jeff, you're saying, yeah, it's basically, maybe there's some differences, but for the most part, it's very similar. Because not having fully worked with it yet, just kind of playing around with it and trying to discover it, I don't know if I'm going into a system that's like, yeah, it's not really as good or as quick as something like an actual server-side rendering language. And that was kind of my main question, but I think you guys covered it really well. And it sounds like it's very comparable and similar.
Sorry.
So we can keep going, Bonnie.
I do want to keep it going because I want to see your code, and Jeff has a hard stop in half an hour. But also, Rob wants to know in chat if the new version 8 will help with any of that.
With the performance, you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Patrick, is there performance stuff in there? I forget.
Which version?
Version 8.
Version 8? Version 8 of what? Oh,
wow,
Node?
let me see.
Are you saying version 8 of Node?
Let me ask him to clarify the question.
Well, he's clarifying. One thing I wanted to throw in there as well is there are kind of two modes for Angular Universal. There is, and actually I'll talk about this when I go through the code too, that there's re-rendering, which means that basically you deploy out Angular Universal like like you're using Express or something like that, and at runtime, once somebody makes a request, you're generating that server view on the fly. That's kind of re-rendering. Every time every time you kind of hit the server, you'll re-render that page. But there's also static rendering as well, pre-rendering, where you just generate a bunch of like static HTML, like a build time, and then you deploy it out to a CDN or whatever. And one thing that like when I started, when Patrick and I both started building in this, like I honestly didn't think that I would ever use like the static. I picture that as like, oh, for blog posts. Okay, like that's the only time you would use like a static rendering or a documentation site or something like that. But in reality, it's kind of interesting. Like you look around and there's actually a pretty strong ecosystem of people throughout the various different communities that are really high on using static rendering patterns. And by that I mean, instead of deploying out an Express server and re-rendering your page and then putting edge caching on top of it, like a Akamai or a Cloudflare or something like that, which caches some pages on top of that. Instead of doing that, you sort of flip things around and you statically render all of your server-side pages. So you have like, depending on how many pages you have in your site, thousands or whatever else. And then you just have like a process running in the background, like that periodically pushes out new static pages. And you can even get really complex. Like I've been talking with David East about some of the stuff that they're doing for Firebase hosting. And what he's set up, which is pretty awesome. He's going to publish some blog posts actually really soon about this, which is to do static rendering and then have a system set up where you use like Firebase functions to trigger, like you might regularly generate new static pages, but you also, whenever there's certain data updates, that you use Firebase functions to trigger regenerating certain pages on the fly. So then you sort of somewhat have the same thing as you would have for the re-rendering with a Cloudflare on top of it, except that it's even better performant in general at a much cheaper cost in terms of hosting, because static hosting in general is much cheaper than dynamic hosting. And Patrick, I think you've done a lot of static hosting stuff before as well, right?
Yeah, and I'm going to show that. But to answer the question for Node, for V8 Node,
V8, not version 8. That was my fault. Sorry.
Yeah,
I was thinking it looked like a V8 engine, but I'm just so used to seeing the V with version. But yeah, V8.
Yeah, as Chrome updates that engine, Node becomes faster, and then Universal becomes faster. So yeah. So I'm going to show you some code if you guys are cool with
Demo
that.
time.
Yeah. So this is our website, and this is generated with static it's all static, right? It's all like this is an HTML page and everything, right? But it's actually using Universal. So if you inspect it, you can see that it has all of the corresponding ngHouston, etc. in here. And we do that by just creating the whole application using Angular. So this is one of my projects I'm working on. So for this one, you could build a client-side app. This is client-side rendered. So it's building that, cool story. And then when that gets done, 10 years later, it's going to reset this. Or I should probably reset. Oh, actually, it doesn't matter to reset that. So it generates a public file with all of the corresponding index and everything. So this is the app root. And if I go in here and I refresh, you can see that it has the loading bar, right? Because this is like back in the day, like client-side rendering apps that we do right now, right? Now you can do the same thing with server-side rendering, right? And then that will do another build. And then this will do, well, let's just wait for a build. So this will create another folder, and this will generate the actual server, right? And then this is for the dynamic rendering, right? So go right here. Oops, do it next. Okay, well, I changed something there. So that one is a mid demo here. So let's go to.
I think it's kind of a rule. It's like the law. If you do a live demo, you have to have a typo at least once. So.
Yeah. Well, this one, this is a project I'm working on where you're able to like generate every single type of version of Universal within your application. So right here, I'm generating a Universal application. This is rendering on the server and the client. So if you refresh the page, you can see that there's a Universal demo here that didn't have an actual value. So you can see right here, demo site or Universal demo. Yeah, so Universal demo 1. And then the client side takes over and then increments this number here, right? So if you refresh, if you can see that, it's actually rendering on the server, and then the client side is taking over. Yeah, and then,
that's really cool.
yeah, if my other demo was working, or my other one was working, but what's cool about Universal is that it's basically Angular all the way down. So you just create a platform server and a browser server. And then this is your application that's Universal that runs on both sides. And then you just share like other stuff. Like here's your client side main file, right? And then this is your server side application that bootstraps Universal.
So can I ask you a question? If you have this theoretically set up right, you shouldn't have to, like once you have Angular Universal set up for your project, is it like Webpack where get it and forget it? Do you need to go back and keep, like as you're building your project and you're refactoring and putting more features, are you going to need to go and update Universal, or once it's installed, it's going to go by itself?
Yeah, so that's the thing is that with Angular Universal, you're creating two bundles. You're creating the server bundle and the client bundle, right? And whenever the server bundle is generated, it will reset the server, right? And then the client file will be bundled. And then whenever you go to the page, it's going to get the latest version of that.
So you're not, once you have it all set up, you're not doing any more work. It's just taking everything and it's handling it for you, and it's just making it, it's just serving it for you.
Yeah, and then that's when you get the setup built correctly. But there we have starter repos, and there's an integration with a Universal in the CLI at the moment, so you can play around with that.
The Angular CLI?
Yeah.
See that this reminds me of Webpack, because I wanted to use Webpack, but I didn't want to use one of those boilerplate. You know, I wanted to actually build my own Webpack config, and that was painful the first time I made a Webpack config, because I had to go through and like learn all this stuff. And once I got it done, actually it looked exactly like the boilerplate that I had started with, but it took me, but I went through and learned it. And then once all that was done, like I never had to touch it again. Then I had Webpack in my project and it was all, beautiful, and it worked the way it should. And it wasn't really any extra work. So I think like the intimidating thing of, oh, I don't want to have to learn another thing. But once you get it set up the way you want it, like you don't have to keep on, messing with it. You just do your Angular stuff that you would normally do, and it's there. That's awesome.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, one thing I would mention though with what you're saying, Bonnie, is that it is important to recognize that whenever you are building a multi-platform app, so in other words, it's not just client and server. So when we talk about Angular Universal, we're talking about having it so that the Angular app can run in the browser, but it also can be rendered, for the server, either build time or, runtime. But there's also other platforms, right? Like there's Electron that you could do with Angular. You can do Ionic, right? You can do NativeScript. And so whenever you're authoring in one language for multiple platforms, there is going to be certain things that are specific to that platform. I mean, it's just inevitable. And the key thing, in the browser there, especially when you reference the window directly, for example, there's no window on the server. The Angular APIs abstract out some of that, so they provide some decent mocking or other functionality. But it is something that you have to be aware of, that when you are building your app and you are doing something, like you got to have this almost like just a trigger in your mind of like, okay, I'm writing something that will only work in the browser. So then you have to like abstract it out. Like usually you basically use DI, right? You use the dependency injector. So you have a service with a common interface, and there's a client version, the implementation, and a server version. And then when you actually bootstrap your app, you have different modules, and so your DI would get different providers for those. So does that make sense?
Yeah. I had that problem actually. I don't remember, 3 years, maybe 4 years ago. I was trying to do something new, and I came across this window undefined, and I was like, "What do you mean window undefined?" Oh, because there's no browser. Yeah, that was the thing. I remember. So yeah, that's awesome. I think Patrick said he got the SSR fix. Patrick, do you want to?
Oh yeah, I could get back to that. So what I was trying to show you is that you could render the application on the server, right? And just the server, just serve the website.
Hold on. In the chat, they said the console text was a little small. Rob said the in editor is good, browser is good, but the console's small. Can you make the text bigger?
Oh.
Just on the console?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's better.
Oh man. I mean, you don't really need to see it. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so this generated, I can't really zoom in on here, but like this generated a dist and a server. And this is how we used to do server-side rendering apps, which is create a server file and then generate the file on the server, or generate the HTML on the server, right? So we spin up this here. And if we go to the website, this is a clearly just a server-side rendered application. There's no client running because this number is not incrementing. And then at the same time, we could build a server, a static site generated website. So this is what people used to do way back in the day, and that's like, why don't we just generate the whole application in folder structure, right? So I don't know if you see this, but you see that we have a public folder that has an index, and then that's then an about page with an index. And then if we run that, now this history server is just a regular server. It's not, we're not running anything else. This could be like Nginx if you wanted to, right? And we could see that, well, it kind of sucks because there's no flash, but if you click on everything, it's actually loading the index. So you can see that there's a trailing slash here because there's something, the server is just serving stuff statically, and you can see the actual file here, or the index, right? And that's just showing like with Universal, you're able to generate files as well as use any form of like how we develop websites in the past, as well as the future, as well as anything, any sort of mixture. So in some cases, you want to create the whole page with Universal or Angular, and then you want a subset of that to be loaded with the client-side application. So, so with our application here, that's what we do. We basically have the whole thing in Angular, and then we actually load a very small subset of JavaScript just for the basic stuff like forms. So
Patrick, while you're on this view right now, one of my main selling points that got me to be interested in the Universal project is being able to create things like this, like a marketing site with server-side template or generation, the static generators. So you just serve all the HTML, and there's not a whole lot of logic in there. There's not like a lot of app stuff. It's just static site. What have been your challenges, either in your, like, because that website looks great. What has been your challenge in making that editable by non-technical people? So like WordPress and those kinds of things, you have a CMS and a database, but here you don't. So have you tackled that problem yet, or is everything just hard-coded in your files?
Yeah, so the way that we tackle that is the same way that it's kind of like the feature of CMSs, and that CMSs are basically going to be exactly that, just content management, right? And then the developer is going to make an API call to get said content and then embed it inside of the application. So our website that I showed you earlier does exactly that. We host all the content in Contentful, and then we can have anyone else edit that at any time, and then we just statically generate the whole website at build time, and then we just serve it all to them.
You guys build a webhook in Contentful, right? So when they make a change, it redeploys the site basically, or rebuilds it.
Yeah.
Okay, and that was the option I was looking at too. That product seems pretty stable and pretty clean and fresh. So that's really cool.
Yep. So it's cool because it creates it allows the marketing and content creators and copywriters to do their job, while the developer could just focus on the application itself.
Yeah.
And then everything just kind of wires up together.
And I've been using Angular I've been using the new Angular since January. So, however long that's been now. And the idea of putting everything in Angular is really exciting. And so that's why I liked this project so much, is we have opportunities to do things like do static site generation with Angular. So that means we could Angularize everything. And I think with ngHouston and Bonnie, I think you like that idea too, is if we could make everything Angular on our side, our day-to-day, like I get to write Angular only.
We could take over the world.
Not for the sake of pigeonholing myself or something, but for the sake of like building my craft and becoming really good at this one application style and format is what kind of intrigued me about this. So yeah, that's my kind of 2 cents on the subject.
Yeah, I never really wanted to commit to Angular and be like an Angular developer, but after a couple of years, I mean, it's really good. So, hey, I have another question for Jeff. Going back to what you were talking about with the windows and having to abstract around your browser stuff, and I have had that problem, so I know what you're talking about. Is there anything that you guys have done, like specifically, like you get that Windows Undefined thing, right? Are there things that you guys have done in Angular Universal to address that at all? Can you do all of our work for us?
we talked about at one point creating a bunch of like common, like the window is a good example, or certain things there where we know that most people will make that mistake. And so I believe that actually, is it still in there, Patrick, where we have like, we at least do like the window mocking and we give some sort of error? Like I forget, we had that in there at one point, and then there was a debate because like in some ways it's a bad thing to have like you could bake it into the framework to mock it out. But in some ways it's a bad thing because then it delays the developer realizing that there's a problem with them trying to. They think that it's available, but it's really
Yeah,
not.
that's a good point.
You know what I
Good
mean? So
Yeah,
Patrick,
because if you do it, it'll immediately throw an error and break everything, and you have to stop and fix it.
So that's sort of good. And I forget, Patrick, what happened for the, like, where does it sit? Like, did we keep that mock in there, or did we take it out? I forget.
Well, at one point we had a mock where if you do anything to window, it'll just throw an error and tell you you shouldn't do that. But because when you add universal, you're really venturing into like node development, and that's like a whole other field. So like because of that, like there's so many different configurations that people would prefer that that we kind of had to create the least amount of opinion, right? So we couldn't really introduce that. But it's really clear if you run into a window error that, hey, you don't have that, right? So that's just been the consensus, is like it is a clear error as opposed to like trying to account for it.
The problem I used to have was like, especially with the console log in Internet Explorer, that tells you just a long time ago. You kids these days, you don't have to deal with Internet Explorer, right? But that was the thing, is I'm developing in Chrome, and if I forget to check it in Internet Explorer and I leave a console log in there, then I'm going to have somebody else telling me, oh, it doesn't work in Internet Explorer, we don't know why, and I'm like, oh, it's because the console log's in there.
Dates are fun. If you ever dates, because in Chrome, all the date formats and all the dates, everything always works. And then you think everything's gravy, and then you try it in Safari, and then this certain date format does not exist, and you're like, what? But yeah, I feel your pain.
Yeah, I remember when I first started doing development a long, long time ago, and it was and I was having so many problems with Internet Explorer, and then I joined a development team, and I met other developers, and they all complained about the same thing, and I was so happy. I felt like they feel my pain.
Yeah.
I should mention that there's actually 3 ways you can abstract out or deal with the issue of like something not being available on the server side. So I mentioned 2 of them already. There's DI. So if if you have that ability to use a common interface and a different provider for each, there's mocking. So like just like monkey patching, you can set on the global object on the node side, like there is some sort of window thing, even though it really isn't. And I don't really suggest that, but at least it's something that you could do for if you really wanted to. But there's also a third one. There is the ability that some people use with Webpack to change out a file, replace one file with another at build time. And that one in particular can be useful if you need to have different components or component-related files, like so your CSS or HTML files. And so I see this a lot actually with, sometimes with Universal, but for sure if you're doing something like, you're trying to share the same app with, like, let's say NativeScript and your browser, I see that a lot. So you would, in that case, at the component level, you can't DI abstract stuff. It's only at the service level you can do that. So if you wanted to, you can't really use DI to like change which component you load. So you can instead just name the files like, so like it's like foo.component, right? So you would have your foo.component, which is your, like, let's say your browser one, and then foo.server.component. And in your Webpack configuration, you would just tell that to like switch out one for the other when you at build time. So does that make sense?
It does make sense. I know we're starting to run out of time, and you said you had to be somewhere, but I mean it's kind of an interesting topic. And do you know? I mean, if somebody is just catching this and they want to learn more specifically about swapping files like that, because I think I've seen, Victor was talking about that at ngConf last year. Do you know if there's a blog post, if you can find one and tweet it out, that would talk more if somebody wanted to learn more about like how to swap a file?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we can get some links on that. Because
yeah, it would be good, because that's one of those things when I watch stuff like this sometimes, and I'm like, oh, show me how to do that, right? So if there's a blog post, we'll tweet it and we'll retweet it. So if anybody's watching this, just watch that Twitter and we'll show you what the code looks like.
Yeah, and I can give you, I did have some code that I wanted to, or I could show if you wanted as well,
Yeah.
for a little 5-minute run through. So my example, Patrick gave like more of a somewhat real world example. The one that I am going to go over is, this is actually what I use in Preboot to test the Preboot application, but I like to kind of use this just because it's really, really simple. So you can grok, like you can fit in your brain kind of like the entirety of this example, because it doesn't have like kind of the real world craziness that usually goes on. And the actual rendering side itself, like I should mention that this isn't particularly useful in the real world, what I'm using here, the JIT compiler, because this is not AOT compatible. But the reason why I'm using this is just to demonstrate like this super simple example where I'm basically using JIT to take in a server component. So like this is app module, which I'll dive into that in a second, a particular module. And basically I'm compiling the module and I'm adding the document. So like this is like the actual index.html, like your main document. And it's being, essentially the server side app is rendering in this app root. And basically it just generates static HTML, and you can do whatever you want with static HTML. So in this case, I'm just like outputting it to a file, but you can do whatever. So this is like, in terms of like the highest level of rendering your server view, this is, you can look in the GitHub/Angular/Preboot and the kind of test examples if you kind of want to take a look at this and play around with it. And sometimes it's fun just to try to see, like this is a level below, like the current Angular universal library is kind of like a higher level than this because it uses Express. This doesn't even use Express. This is just like generating static HTML. So if I dive into the server module here, just to point out a couple things. So you'll see that we use, instead of, let's do the client module or browser module. So in your browser module, the thing that you're probably used to is, that you include like your browser module from platform browser into your Angular app. And the difference here is that instead of browser module, we have platform server and server module. So that's the only difference between these two, browser module and server module. There's also optionally, you don't have to do this, but optionally, if you do want Preboot, I mentioned that's the thing that records events and then plays it back. Basically, that's a separate module. So on the server side, you're recording events. So this is the kind of simplest form to record. And then on the browser side, you're replaying them. So anything that's recorded, it will replay back for the browser app. So a lot of times it's like a button click, for example, and then the button click will replay once the client side loads. And if you have a handler for that, it does whatever it does. And then for the switching between like server and client implementations, this is kind of an example where I'm just static value. Like I just have current platform, and this is like super simple. It's just a string. So like on here, if you inject current platform on the server side, it's going to display or be the string server view, whereas on the client it'll be client view. So that's just like a super simple example of like kind of DI splitting, the thing I mentioned before. But both of these bootstrap the same thing. So like you'll notice that like the app component here is the exact same on both the client and the server view. So like even though the modules are different, the actual root component is exactly the same. So let's go to that. Yeah, so this, again, is the same code that would be on the client and the server. And like I mentioned, I'm injecting that token, which will, because of what I'm setting in the module, will be different, and then displaying it. So At this level and below here, it's exactly the same. Like I'm using the same files, like I'm not splitting it out or anything like that. And this is just rendered as it is. So, I mean, that's the, yeah, that was all I wanted to show. So it's definitely a simple example, but hopefully that kind of makes it a little easier to understand.
So I know, Jeff, that we have a lot of beginners that join us on these talks and stuff. And I know that sometimes when you introduce like Node.js servers and stuff into your stack, that it can get a little bit more involved, I guess would be the best way to say it. So what advice would you guys give for when is it the right time to use Universal, and maybe when is it not the right time? When is it maybe just not a good choice? And I know that you can't answer that too specifically, not knowing the situation, but for the sake of we having beginners, and do they really need the server-side rendering, and is Universal worth pursuing? At what point do you think it's worth looking into and then actually getting involved in?
So for me, I mean, there's probably there's smaller use cases or edge cases, but to try to simplify it the most, it's basically if your app is publicly facing, like you can basically, someone on the internet can search, get to it and find it and use it. In my mind, that is a good, that is the difference, that you want to use Angular Universal in that case.
For me, there's really two kind of websites, right? There's dynamic websites and then there's static websites. And the real reason between the two is because for static websites, the main thing for it is content, as opposed to the dynamic website where it's the experience, right? For example, Gmail. Gmail is a dynamic website because you click around, you do stuff, and usually open up the Gmail at the very beginning of your day, and then that's pretty much it, right? So it doesn't really make sense to do server-side rendering there because they're only going to get a better experience for the morning, right? As opposed to Wikipedia, where it's like, I need this information right now, right? Or that's a better way to think about it. Is your website a place where users need to get information right away, or your users use your website off and on, right? That's content driven. Then it makes sense. If your website is something that your users are constantly on, then you're improving the initial experience, and if that's your goal, then that's your goal. Otherwise, it's not too important to use it for those dynamic websites, right? And those are also known as applications. So it really depends, because it could also be like if you need to increase your conversions in your application itself, your dynamic application, then you want to get them into the application as soon as possible, in which case it does kind of make sense to kind of venture down that way to lower that. It's also great to use Universal for kind of the mixed case, like a dynamic application, but I have a referral system. And the referral system, I have to show them, like I have to have a public-facing page that's similar to my whole application, right? And so you might need to server render one page for the referral network that needs to be public. And with Universal, it's great because you can say, oh, well, this is easy. I just need to make sure this page works with Universal and then make it public, as opposed to recreating the whole page in a whole other framework, right?
Yeah, you bring up some good nuanced points there, Patrick. I definitely agree that if another way to actually say one part of it is that, like, I've always thought if the stuff that you're displaying can be anonymous, like it's not user specific, that for sure, like publicly facing and anonymous, that for sure, like should be server rendered. When it's personalized, then it's questionable, like depending on whether it's a long running app or whatever else. I mean, like Twitter, for example, is like all personalized content, right? But they are server rendered because they have like in their case, it comes down to one other thing Patrick mentioned, that like that's like a core goal of them, is like that initial time to first tweet, like they have like some internal statistics of like that's like an important thing to have. Whereas Gmail, people expect it to load like, the spinner for a little bit, and then you're in it for like all day. So they don't care that much about it, and it probably isn't worth it. Like the effort that it would take in order to do Gmail, so rendering, like they wouldn't get any benefit back from it. So like for some of those types of things, yeah, you got to like weigh the cost benefit.
Thanks. That was really good insight. And it's cool to see that you can mix and match a little bit, which I wasn't fully aware of, that if I have a couple public facing pages, I could do that. And so now I might actually use Universal in my current project, and I didn't even realize it. So thanks for the insight.
Yeah, that's really like the power of just using Angular all the way down, is that you might realize, oh wait, I have to do that, right? And then it's there.
Right.
I like the fact that you can use Angular Universal, and once you get your config files set up, you're going to keep on doing what you've been doing. Pretty much, I mean, with some exceptions like the window, stuff like that, but pretty much you're gonna just go along your business and write your Angular, and it's just going to take care of it all in the back end. So it's not like another thing I need to learn. It's just a config file, and then you're fine.
I have to unfortunately jump off, guys.
Thank you so much for coming. This was awesome.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Thank you for inviting me. It's definitely fun. Definitely send me, if you guys have any questions on stuff I said, or I'll send you some links to include in this as well. Yeah,
definitely. Send them and tag us, and we'll retweet them. So there's some. I know that. What were we talking about? The I turned the page, but subbing out files. That was an interesting one.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, tell Carolyn we all said hello.
Will do. All right. See ya.
Yeah.
Right. Hey, Patrick, if you have time, I know we're out of time, but do you have time for another question? Because Rob in the chat, who always has good questions, asked a question that I wanted to ask earlier, but I knew that we were running out of time and I didn't want to keep Jeff late. Do you have time for a question?
Yeah, I can answer other questions.
What's the difference between ahead of time compilation and universal?
Yeah, so ahead of time compilation just means that you have a compiler in your application. A compiler is just like, I need to convert this template into JavaScript, right? So the ahead of time just means that I'm going to render these templates into JavaScript at build time, ahead of time, like ahead of the thing running, right? And with Universal, it's kind of similar, but similar in that idea, but it's completely different, right? So
hold on, can I explain this just so that you can tell me whether or not I understand it properly? Because I think I know the answer, but I just learned, like I didn't know anything about Universal before we started tonight, but I think I got this. Yeah. But you got to tell me if I'm wrong. So basically, with Universal, you have your Angular code, right? But if you write your Angular code and you try to run it in the server, like you don't have all the router stuff and everything. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to take all your Angular code, it's going to run the Angular magic and do all your interpolation and render it all, and then it's going to snapshot it and just take all that HTML and then serve it for you. Is that right?
Yeah. So with ahead of time, you basically can convert your templates into JavaScript, right? And then that's still the same Angular application. And then you use that Angular application and you insert it to, like, say, the Express engine, which will convert that component it'll bootstrap it and then convert it into a string, but then that will be sent to the client. So the idea is similar, where you could, even with Universal, pre-render the page again. So you would ahead of time compile your templates, your Angular templates, to JavaScript, right? And then convert that to a string by bootstrapping it during build time, and then convert it to a string. And then from there, you just like push it to the CDN or something.
So for things like if you have a user logged in and you have customized content for the user, then ahead of time compilation would be good because you're still getting all that dynamic behavior. Whereas if you're really focused on making sure that you can have that SEO and all that, the Google search engine stuff, and having the social media, then Universal's best. But you could still use, I mean, if you care about both of those things, you could use both of them.
Yeah, as Jeff mentioned, like Twitter, for example, where it's the concerns are both, right? You want to have content is king there, but then you also want the dynamic experience, the long list. Everything on the web is just a list, right? So you want to be able to scroll down infinitely, right? So with Twitter and some other applications, you're in this approach where you just have a hybrid solution, and that's where applications are kind of going. Is that it's really just hybrid at this approach at this point, where it's like you need this here, you kind of need this page to be server rendered, but this page needs to be fully dynamic. So websites now that I've seen and I've been working with have been a mixture of the two.
What about AMP? Are you familiar with that whole AMP thing?
Yeah, so one of the experiments that I was playing around with is basically allowing you to build your application as you normally would, but include kind of AMP components, and then render your page, your website, into an AMP website by stripping out everything else that's not the AMP components, and then converting the AMP components to actual AMP tags. But AMP, all right, so let me just step back. AMP is just a
AMP just opened Pandora's box. Sorry.
Yeah. So I explained the thing. I explained a solution without explaining what the thing is. So AMP is just basically saying, hey, we should rewrite the web because the way that we're serving content is not fast enough, and that's mostly due to ads being the way it is. So they said, hey, why don't we just like optimize the website to render the fastest possible, right? So it's basically a framework where under the hood it's doing all the best rendering, like it's consolidating all the images, all the best practices you would do in a website normally, but it's kind of hidden away from you, so you don't have to deal with it, and you can just focus on your content, right? So AMP is kind of like a framework for fast content, basically.
So how does AMP go with Universal? Would you, or do they do the same thing, or would you use them together, or would you use one or the other, depending on the situation? I mean, it seems like it's almost kind of the same thing, right? Or it solves the same problem. Kind
of like AMP is like an ambitious project of like, let's just recreate the whole web, and there's there's a lot of opinions on that, right? So it's really like they're orthogonal, like they could work together. Like with the goal that I'm trying to achieve eventually is allowing someone to write the same Angular application and get a generated AMP application at the same time. But to do that, you would have to provide like AMP hints to say, this is what it would look like in AMP, and then it would render the AMP page right next to the other page. But again, that's like more advanced stuff that I was going to do later. But yeah, AMP is just, it's similar, but it's completely different, if that makes sense.
Would it, and I dabbled a little bit in AMP just to kind of see what it would do and, you know, how to set it up. And it was, again, one of those things like, oh man, I have to learn something else. But then once I started playing with it, it's not a whole lot. It's not like you're going to rewrite all your stuff. You're just going to add a couple tags and let it know, you know, this and that. It didn't really take too long to set up. But do you think that, and keep in mind, I don't really know a whole lot about server-side stuff because I've been doing a lot of front-end stuff for years, right? So I know the front end pretty well, but not necessarily the server. Is that something that is possible? Like if you, I guess it wouldn't, I was thinking, is that something that you can automate? But you can't really, because like you need to, you know what your image is. And so there's a couple, it's a kind of a setup thing. But do you think that's something that could be like when you use Universal, it can, you have shortcuts to do that?
So I thought about like making the tools for that where, all right, so the idea is basically being able to work on your actual application, but have a preview of your AMP page right next to it. So whatever you change here affects that one. And that's something that I'm aspiring to create eventually, like one day. When I find the time, I'll get to it.
We believe in you, Patrick.
Yeah. Or, you know, anyone's, feel free to sponsor the project. But it would be great to have like them work together where you could provide like AMP hints and just build one app, but be able to have your actual application and your AMP page generated at the same time. But yeah, you could also use Universal to generate and create AMP pages. So that's a thing too.
I actually made friends with one of the AMP guys because I was doing just a real quick. I was doing like an ngConf, what I learned at ngConf for ngHouston, and I just wanted to do a really super quick AMP demo. And I had it all working, I thought, and then like I was just going over everything right before I left for the meetup, and something wasn't working, and I was like freaking out, like I have to talk about this in an hour, and now it won't work, and I don't know why. So I grabbed this guy, and he was actually a really nice guy. He jumped on Hangout and helped me figure out what was wrong with it. But yeah, I should. If you do you know people on the AMP team? You know Rob, right? Rob, that's like Rob's thing.
Yeah, that's Rob's thing.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was gonna introduce you to this guy, but I'm like, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure you know more people than I do who are doing that kind of stuff. Oh yeah. So hey, one of the guys in the chat wants to know, are Java backend supported? If not, is it on the roadmap anytime soon?
So for Google, they're working on the Java implementation. I don't know what stage that is in, but you could create a comment in the repo. There's an issue for the Java integration, but the way that would work is that there's a few different ways that we could go about this. One is create a node instance and then just ping it for a string, and then the string will just be sent over to Java land. Or in Java, we just run like Nashville or something, or JS inside of Java, and then run Universal in there, and then convert it to a string. But there's even like a few prototypes with this approach, with both approaches online. But to find more information about that, there's a GitHub issue on the Universal repo.
I actually just Googled GitHub Angular Universal Java and popped it up. It's issue number 280.
Yep.
Cool. Josh, you got any more questions for Patrick?
I don't think so. I mean, I learned a lot today, so thanks a lot, man. It's always awesome to meet the people making it. And so, Bonnie, good job. I mean, Bonnie's always getting the rock stars here. The people, at least the tech hot rock stars.
Yeah, I was telling.
We're not rock stars, but we're rock stars in our own sense. But it's really always exciting to talk to the people that are making these things, and not just like, random strangers or people that just use it, but people that are actually behind the scenes. So it's really cool.
Yeah, I knew Jeff from ngConf. I ran into Jeff a couple times from ngConf, and we were picking talks together last year. He was pretty cool, but I didn't know Patrick, but I've been following Patrick. I was telling him before we started the meetup tonight that I've been following. He was like one of the first people that I followed on Twitter a long time ago, and but I hadn't actually had a chance to hang out with him. So Patrick, thank you so much for coming and chatting with us. This was fun, and you're welcome back anytime.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And Josh, thank you as always. Chris, I don't know if we have Chris, because I haven't heard a peep out of Chris, but
I'm here. It was great presentation. It's nice to see what outside of sort of my Ionic Angular bubble that I live in, to see what's going on in that space. It was really great. So thanks for it.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it for tonight, you guys. Thank you so much for joining us, and Patrick, Josh, Chris, and Jeff Whelpley, and come back anytime. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Bye, guys.
Have a good night.
Yeah.